The heavy oak doors opened before I could say one word. I was standing in the grand foyer of my own restaurant, my chef's coat pristine and my heart hammering against my ribs, while my father's entire social circle stared at me like I was a common waiter who had forgotten his place. My father, Alistair Vance, had just tossed a crumpled $10 bill onto the host stand and said, "This place is for the elite. Someone like you should be cleaning the floors, not blocking the view." Then my mother, Beatrice, pointed toward the service entrance and sneered, "Get out of our sight before you embarrass us further." That was the moment the private elevator opened, and the man who stepped inside made every person in that crowded lobby go silent. But let me back up a little. 3 years ago, I was sitting at a mahogany dining table in my parents' mansion in Greenwich. It was my 26th birthday, and instead of a celebration, it was an interrogation. Alistair sat at the head of the table, his eyes cold as he looked at my sketches for a modular, high-concept kitchen. I told them I wanted to start small, focusing on flavor and technique rather than gold-leaf nonsense. I told them I had found a dilapidated diner at a bankruptcy auction and, through a series of incredible coincidences, I had secured the lease and the rusted equipment for exactly $40 and a promise to pay the back taxes. Alistair hadn't even finished his wine before he started laughing. It wasn't a kind laugh. It was a jagged, mocking sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "A $40 restaurant," he gasped, wiping his mouth with a silk napkin. "Julian, you were educated at the finest schools. We expected you to take over the Vance Group, not play with dirt in a kitchen that costs less than a pair of my socks." Beatrice joined in, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "Darling, you have the Vance name. Why drag it through the grease of a failure? You'll be begging for a job within a month." Even my sister, Serafina, the golden child of the corporate world, didn't look up from her phone as she muttered, "It's embarrassing, Julian. Just give it up." That night, I left the mansion with nothing but my $40 investment and a fire in my gut that no amount of mockery could extinguish. I moved into a studio apartment that smelled like old cardboard and spent 18 hours a day at that dilapidated diner. My only ally was Silas Thorne, a man I'd met in culinary school who had been discarded by the industry for being too experimental. Together, we scrubbed floors until our knuckles bled. We repaired that $40 stove with spare parts found in junkyards. We didn't have a marketing budget, so we let the scent of smoked hickory and fermented garlic do the talking. Around the second year, the transformation began. We didn't just fix the diner, we evolved it. We renamed it L'Enigme, the Enigma. We stopped taking walk-ins. We stopped advertising. I wanted the food to be a secret that people had to earn. I became the ghost chef, never appearing in the dining room, never doing interviews. The mystery fueled the fire. Soon, the $40 investment was generating enough revenue to buy the entire building, then the block. We turned the space into a cathedral of gastronomy, where the elite would pay thousands just to breathe the air near our kitchen. But to my family, I was still the failure who disappeared. They never called. They never checked in. In their world, if you weren't mentioned in the Wall Street Journal, you didn't exist. That brings us to tonight. It was the 3rd anniversary of L'Enigme, and the waiting list had reached a staggering 18 months. Not even kings could get a table on short notice. I was in the kitchen, plating a dish of deconstructed truffle carbonara, when Silas walked in, his face pale. "Julian," he whispered, "you need to see the security feed in the foyer." I looked at the monitor. There they were. Alistair, Beatrice, and Serafina. They were dressed in thousands of dollars of designer labels, looking impatient and entitled. They didn't have a reservation. They thought the Vance name was a universal key. I watched through the camera as Alistair barked at my head host. "Do you have any idea who I am? I don't wait 3 hours for a table. I'm Alistair Vance. I want the owner out here, now." The host, trained to perfection, remained calm. "I'm sorry, sir, but the owner doesn't see guests, and we are at capacity." That's when I decided to step out. Not as the owner, but just to see if they would even recognize the son they had discarded over a $40 dream. As I walked into the foyer, the air felt thick with the smell of expensive perfume and Alistair's burning ego. When he saw me in my chef's whites, unbranded and simple, he didn't see the owner of the world's most exclusive restaurant. He saw the loser he'd laughed at 3 years ago. "Julian?" Beatrice gasped, her eyes scanning my apron with disgust. "What are you doing here? Did you finally run out of money? Are you working the line for tips?" Alistair stepped forward, his face hardening into that familiar mask of disappointment. "I should have known. You're probably the reason the service is so slow. Move aside, boy. We're here to see the person in charge, not the family disappointment." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a $10 bill, and dropped it on the host stand like he was tipping a valet. "Go get us a table in the VIP section and keep the change. Maybe you can buy a better pair of shoes." The silence that followed was deafening. My staff looked at me, their eyes wide, waiting for the signal to throw them out. I felt the old sting of their words, the way they used to make me feel small. But then, I looked around at the marble floors I had polished, the custom lighting I had designed, and the empire I had built from $40. I wasn't that boy anymore. I straightened my posture, my eyes meeting my father's with a coldness he had taught me himself. "I'm afraid even $10 won't buy you a seat tonight, Alistair," I said quietly. Beatrice stepped forward, pointing her manicured finger at my chest. "How dare you use that tone with your father? We are guests. We are the Vances. Get out of our way before I have the manager fire you on the spot." I opened my mouth to respond, to finally tell them that the grease they despised was the foundation of the very building they were standing in. But before a single word could leave my lips, the private elevator behind the host stand chimed. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, and a man stepped out whose face graced the cover of every international business magazine. It was Elias Sterling, the world's most powerful food critic and the man who held the keys to the culinary kingdom. Everyone in the lobby went stone still. Alistair's mouth actually hung open. Elias Sterling didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at my father. He walked straight toward me with a wide, genuine smile and held out his hand. "Chef Vance," he said, his voice booming through the silent room. "That tasting menu was a masterpiece. The $40 legend is true, you've created a miracle." My father's face went from pale to a ghostly white. Beatrice's hand dropped to her side as she stared at the man shaking my hand. Serafina finally looked up from her phone, her eyes bugging out of her head. Elias turned his head slightly, noticing the tension. "Julian, are these people bothering you? I thought you had a strict no-harassment policy for your staff." I looked at Alistair, whose eyes were darting between me and the most influential critic in the world. The realization was slowly sinking in like a lead weight. The $40 restaurant hadn't failed. It had become the very thing they were desperate to be a part of. And they had just insulted the owner in front of the one man who could destroy their social standing with a single tweet. Alistair tried to find his voice. "Chef Vance," he stammered, the words sounding like ash in his mouth. "Julian, what is Mr. Sterling talking about?" I looked at the $10 bill still sitting on the host stand. I picked it up, folded it neatly, and handed it back to my father. "You're right, Dad," I said, my voice steady and devoid of the pain I used to feel. "This place is for the elite. And unfortunately, the owner doesn't think you meet the criteria." "Silas?" Silas stepped forward, a smirk playing on his lips. "Yes, chef?" "Please show these people to the door," I said, turning my back on them. "They've waited 3 hours for a table they're never going to get." As I began to walk back toward the kitchen with Elias Sterling, I heard Beatrice let out a strangled cry of "Julian, wait," but I didn't stop. I could feel their eyes burning into my back, a mixture of shock, greed, and the sudden, terrifying realization that the son they had mocked was now the man who held the power they so desperately craved. But as the kitchen doors swung shut behind me, I knew this was only the beginning of the evening, because while they were being escorted out, I had noticed something in my father's hand, a legal folder with the Vance Group logo on it. They hadn't just come for dinner. They had come for something else, and the secret hidden in those papers was about to turn my $40 victory into a war for my very survival. The kitchen doors hissed shut behind me, sealing out the sound of Beatrice's desperate cries and the heavy, humiliated silence of my father. For a moment, the only sound was the rhythmic chopping of knives and the roar of the industrial ventilation system. Silas Thorne looked up from the pass, his eyes meeting mine. He didn't ask what had happened. He had seen the folder in Alistair's hand, and he knew the look on my face. Elias Sterling, the man who could make or break a career with a single paragraph, stood beside me, his presence like a grounding wire. He didn't leave. Instead, he leaned against a stainless steel counter and crossed his arms. "You handled that with more grace than I would have, Julian," Elias said, his voice cutting through the kitchen's humidity. "But you know Alistair Vance. A man like that doesn't wait 3 hours for a table just to satisfy a craving for sea bass. He came here to stake a claim." I looked down at the legal folder I had snatched from the host stand in the chaos of their exit. My fingers were trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer adrenaline of finally standing my ground. I opened it. The first thing I saw was the Vance Group logo, a stylized V that had always looked to me like a predator's open maw. "He's trying to buy the block," I whispered, scanning the documents. "Not just the building. The entire historical district." Silas wiped his hands on his apron and stepped closer. "We have a 10-year lease, Julian. He can't just kick us out because we bruised his ego." "You don't understand Alistair," I said, my voice hardening. "He doesn't buy buildings. He buys the ground beneath them. He's filed a petition for urban revitalization. He wants to declare this entire area a blighted zone so he can invoke eminent domain. He wants to turn Lenigme into a parking garage for a 50-story luxury condo." The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. My father had spent my entire life telling me that my passion for cooking was a hobby for servants. He had mocked my $40 tasting menu, calling it poverty play acting. And now, he wanted to literally bulldoze the masterpiece I had built to make room for the very high society world he thought I wasn't good enough for. But let me back up a little. To understand why Alistair's betrayal cut so deep, you have to understand the night I left the Vance estate 10 years ago. It was my 19th birthday. Beatrice had organized a gala, not for me, but for Alistair's newest investors. I was expected to stand in a tuxedo, smile, and say nothing while men in $5,000 suits talked over me. Instead, I had spent the entire afternoon in the kitchen with the catering staff, helping them refine a reduction for the main course. When Alistair found me with a smudge of flour on my cheek, he didn't just pull me aside. He waited until the dining room was full. He stood at the head of the table, clinked his crystal glass, and pointed at me. "My son," he had said, his voice dripping with mock affection, "has decided he prefers the company of the help to the company of his peers. He wants to be a chef. So, I've decided to give him a head start. Julian, since you love the kitchen so much, you can start your career tonight. You're cut off. Not a cent of Vance money will ever touch your hands again. Let's see how far your art gets you when you have to pay for the canvas." I walked out that night with nothing but my knives and the clothes on my back. I spent years sleeping on flour sacks in the back of bakeries in Paris, scrubbing floors in Lyon, and working 20-hour shifts in London. I built Lenigme with sweat, blood, and a $40 vision, that the finest food in the world shouldn't just be for people like Alistair. It should be for the people who actually appreciate the craft. Now, standing in my kitchen with Elias Sterling and Silas, I realized the war had just moved from the dining room to the courtroom. "He thinks he can starve us out," Silas said, looking at the legal papers. "If he buys the surrounding lots, he can cut off our deliveries, block the street with construction, and make it impossible for guests to get here." "He already tried that tonight," I replied, thinking of the 3-hour wait my parents had endured. "He didn't come here to eat. He came here to scout the enemy." Elias Sterling stepped forward, his eyes sharp. "Julian, the world knows you now. Lenigme isn't just a restaurant anymore, it's a cultural landmark. But Alistair Vance has politicians in his pocket. He doesn't care about culture, he cares about square footage. If you're going to fight him, you can't do it from behind a stove." Before I could respond, the kitchen door swung open again. It was the hostess, her face pale. "Chef? There's someone here. She says she's your sister, and she won't leave until she speaks with you. She's making a scene in the lobby." I looked at Silas. He nodded, taking over the pass. I adjusted my white coat and walked out. Serafina Vance was standing in the center of the lobby, her arms crossed over her designer blazer. When she saw me, her expression shifted from irritation to something that looked suspiciously like pity. "Julian," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper as I approached. "We need to talk. Somewhere private. Now." I led her into my small office at the back of the building. It was a cramped space filled with cookbooks, wine crates, and the smell of roasting garlic. Serafina looked around with an expression of pure disdain. "Is this it?" she asked. "This is the kingdom you're fighting so hard for? It's a closet, Julian." "It's a closet I own, Sarah," I said, sitting behind my desk. "Which is more than I can say for your office at the Vance Group. Dad still holds your voting shares, doesn't he?" Her jaw tightened. "I'm here to help you." Dad is beyond furious. "That stunt you pulled with Elias Sterling? It's already on the social blogs. Real estate mogul ejected from son's 5-star restaurant. You made him look like a fool in front of the only people he actually respects." "He did that to himself when he tried to tip my staff like they were beggars," I retorted. Serafina sighed, leaning over the desk. "Julian, listen to me. He's going to crush you." "The urban revitalization plan? It's already been signed off by the council. The demolition crews are scheduled for next month. He's offering you a way out. A graceful exit." She reached into her bag and pulled out a check. She slid it across the desk toward me. I didn't even have to look at it to know there were a lot of zeros. $2 million, she said. "Take the money, close the restaurant quietly, and move to Napa or somewhere quiet. Start over. Just get out of his way." I looked at the check, then back at my sister. The same sister who had watched Alistair humiliate me 10 years ago and said nothing. The same sister who had laughed when Beatrice told everyone I was traveling the world to hide the fact that I was actually working as a line cook. "Why are you really here, Sarah?" I asked. "Is Dad afraid of the bad press? Or is it something else? Is there something on this block he needs more than a parking garage?" For a split second, her eyes flickered. It was a tell we both inherited from our mother, a tiny twitch of the eyelid when we were hiding the truth. "It's just business, Julian," she insisted. "No, it isn't," I said, standing up. "If it were just business, he would have sent a lawyer. He sent you because he thinks I'm still the 19-year-old boy who craves a place at his table. He thinks I'll take the money and run because I'm afraid of him." I picked up the check and slowly, deliberately, tore it into 4 pieces. I dropped them onto the desk like confetti. "Tell Alistair that Lenigme isn't for sale. And tell him that if he wants this building, he's going to have to come down here and tear it down with his own hands because I'm not leaving." Serafina's face went cold. The mask of the helpful sister vanished, replaced by the corporate executive Alistair had spent millions to train. "You were always the emotional one, Julian. It's why you're a cook and we're developers. You think this is a movie where the underdog wins. It's not. It's a balance sheet. And you are a liability that is about to be erased." She turned on her heel and marched out of the office. I stood there for a long time, the silence of the room feeling heavier than the noise of the kitchen. I knew what was coming next. Alistair wouldn't just use legal papers now. He would go for the throat. I walked back into the kitchen. Silas was waiting. "She didn't take it well?" "He's moving the demolition date up," I said. "We have 4 weeks." Silas looked at the bustling kitchen, at the young chefs who had given up high-paying jobs in the city to follow my $40 dream. "What do? We do what we do best," I said, my voice vibrating with a new kind of resolve. "We cook. But we're changing the menu. If Alistair wants a war, we're going to give him a feast he'll never forget. That night, after the last guest had left and the lights were dimmed, I sat alone at table number 4, the same table my parents had coveted. I pulled out a notebook and began to sketch. Not a floor plan, but a menu. Every dish would be a memory. Every course would be a response to a decade of silence and mockery. I was so absorbed in my work that I didn't hear the front door open. I didn't hear the footsteps until they were right behind me. It's a beautiful room, Julian. Even in the dark. I froze. I knew that voice. It wasn't Alistair. It wasn't Serafina. It was Beatrice. My mother stood there, draped in a silk wrap that probably cost more than my entire kitchen staff's monthly payroll. She looked tired. The socialite mask was gone, and for the first time in years, I saw the woman underneath. The restaurant is closed, Mother, I said without looking up. I know, she whispered, pulling out a chair and sitting across from me. I wanted to see it. Without your father watching. I finally looked at her. You stood there while he insulted my staff, you stood there while he tried to buy his way into a house I built with my own hands. Why are you here? Beatrice reached out as if to touch my hand, but I pulled away. She winced. Alistair is a powerful man, Julian. But he is also a desperate one. The Vance Group, it isn't what it used to be. The luxury market is crashing. He needs this redevelopment project to save the company. He's leveraged everything on this block. I narrowed my eyes. Are you telling me the great Alistair Vance is broke? Not broke, she corrected. But fragile. This building is the linchpin. If he doesn't break ground by the end of the month, the banks will pull the funding for the entire project. He'll lose the Vance Group. He'll lose everything. I let out a cold, sharp laugh. So he isn't trying to destroy me because he hates me. He's trying to destroy me because I'm the only thing standing between him and bankruptcy. He won't stop, Julian, she said, her voice trembling. He's already contacted the health department. He's contacted the liquor licensing board. He's going to bury you in inspections and red tape until you can't even open your doors. I leaned back, a dark realization dawning on me. My father wasn't just a villain in my story, he was a failing king trying to sacrifice his son to save a crumbling throne. And what about you, Mother? I asked. Are you here to warn me, or are you here to beg me to save him? Beatrice looked away, her eyes glistening in the moonlight filtering through the window. I'm here because I remember a little boy who used to bake bread in the garden because he said the house felt too cold. I'm here because I realized tonight that you were the only one of us who actually escaped. She stood up, leaving a small, old-fashioned key on the table. That's the key to the historical archives at the Vance estate. There are maps in there, Julian. Maps of this block from before your father bought the land. There's something underneath this building. Something he's terrified the city will find out about. Before I could ask what she meant, she was gone, a ghost in the night. I looked at the key. It was heavy, brass, and felt like a weapon. The next morning, the first blow fell. I arrived at the restaurant to find 2 black SUVs parked out front. Men in suits were already taping a notice of temporary closure to my door. The reason? A reported plumbing irregularity that required an immediate, indefinite shutdown for inspection. Silas was already there, arguing with a man in a city uniform who refused to look him in the eye. This is a hit job. Silas shouted. We just had our inspection 2 weeks ago. We passed with flying colors. I walked up, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked at the city inspector. Who called this in? The man sighed, looking genuinely guilty. Anonymous tip, chef. High-pressure leak reported. Until we can verify the integrity of the lines, no one enters the building. Orders from the top. I looked past him and saw Alistair Vance standing across the street, leaning against his silver town car. He wasn't even hiding. He held a cup of coffee in one hand and his phone in the other. He raised the cup in a mocking toast. He wasn't just closing me down. He was showing me that he owned the very air I breathed. "Silas," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Get the staff together. We're going to my apartment." "Julian, we can't cook from your apartment," Silas said, his face etched with worry. "We aren't going to cook," I said, clutching the brass key in my pocket. "We're going to go for a drive. We're going to the one place Alistair thinks is still his." I looked across the street at my father. He thought he had won. He thought that by closing my doors, he had extinguished my $40 dream. But he had forgotten one thing. I didn't need a kitchen to be a chef. And I didn't need his permission to be a Vance. As we drove away, I saw the demolition crews pulling up to the end of the block. The clock was ticking. But as I looked at the brass key in my hand, I knew the battle for Lenigme had only just begun. My father wanted to build a skyscraper on top of my life, but he was about to find out that the foundations he had built his own life on were far more rotten than he ever imagined. And I was the only one who knew where the cracks were. The drive to the Vance estate felt like a descent into a past I had spent a decade trying to bury. Beside me, Silas was uncharacteristically quiet, his knuckles white as he gripped the door handle. He knew as well as I did that we weren't just looking for a way to save Elise, we were looking for the dirt that would bury my father's legacy before he could bury mine. The estate was a sprawling monolith of cold stone and manicured hedges, a place where silence wasn't a choice but a requirement. I used the service entrance, the brass key Beatrice had given me feeling like a hot coal in my pocket. We bypassed the main house, moving toward the stone structure at the edge of the property, the private library and family archives. Alistair loved records. He loved the idea that the Vance history was written in ink that would never fade. He didn't realize that some ink only becomes visible when you hold it to the fire. The archive smelled of cedar and old paper. Row after row of leather-bound ledgers detailed every acquisition, every demolition, and every bribe paid under the guise of consulting fees. I went straight to the section marked Metropolitan Redevelopment, 1994. That was the year Alistair had acquired the block where Lenigme now stood. "Julian, look at this," Silas whispered, pulling a rolled blueprint from a high shelf. It wasn't a building plan. It was a geological survey. I spread the paper across a mahogany table. It was a map of the city's underground infrastructure from 30 years ago. Right beneath the foundation of my restaurant, there was a crimson circle drawn in Alistair's unmistakable, aggressive handwriting. "The old Katharina Spring," I breathed. My father hadn't just bought the land, he had falsified the earth itself. If the city found out the spring was still active, which it was, as evidenced by the leak Alistair had used to shut me down, his skyscraper project wouldn't just be delayed. It would be cancelled. Permanently. The permits would be revoked, and the fines would run into the hundreds of millions. "He didn't close us down because of a leak, Silas," I said, a cold smile spreading across my face. "He closed us down because he realized that by operating a kitchen there, I was the only person with a legal right to access the basement daily. I was the only one who could see the water levels rising. I'm not just an annoyance to him. I'm the whistleblower who could bankrupt his entire firm." "So what do we do?" Silas asked. "Call the papers, leak the maps?" "No," I said, folding the survey carefully. "Alistair knows how to kill a news story. We're going to do something much more public. We're going to make the city demand to see that basement. But first, we're going to make Lenigme the most famous ghost in the city." For the next 2 weeks, the doors of Lenigme remained locked, the notice of closure still fluttering in the wind. My father's crew stood ready at the end of the block, their bulldozers idling like hungry beasts. But Alistair couldn't move yet. The inspection he had triggered required a mandatory 21-day cooling-off period for the public utility records to be updated. He thought I was hiding in my apartment, licking my wounds. He was wrong. Under the cover of night, Silas and I moved our operations. We didn't need the kitchen at Lenigme to cook. I rented a warehouse on the outskirts of the district, a gritty, industrial space that looked like nothing from the outside. We didn't advertise. We didn't post on social media. Instead, we sent out 50 black envelopes to the 50 most influential food critics, influencers, and underground gourmets in the state. Inside the envelope was a single card, asterisk the enigma has moved. $40. One night. One location. Follow the smoke asterisk. The buzz was instantaneous. In a world of oversaturated marketing, silence is the loudest roar. People started talking about the rebel chef who was being bullied by a billionaire developer. The narrative shifted from a failed restaurant to a David versus Goliath battle. The price remained the same, $40. It was a middle finger to the elite, a signal that quality wasn't for sale to the highest bidder. By the third night of our pop-up operation, the line outside the warehouse stretched for 4 blocks. We were serving the same menu I had perfected at Lenigme, the salt-crusted sea bass, the truffle-infused risotto, the wine that tasted like a summer memory. But here, in the raw, industrial heat of the warehouse, the food tasted like revolution. And then, the moment I had been waiting for arrived. I was in the makeshift kitchen, plating a dish of seared scallops, when Silas leaned over, his voice tight with suppressed laughter. "Julian. Look at the security feed for the front entrance." I looked at the small monitor standing at the very back of a 3-hour-long line, huddled under a shared umbrella in the drizzling rain, were 3 people who looked entirely out of place in this industrial wasteland. Alistair Vance, wearing a $1,000 trench coat that was getting soaked. Beatrice Vance, clutching her designer handbag as if it were a shield. Serafina Vance, looking at her gold watch every 30 seconds with an expression of pure, unadulterated fury. They didn't know the warehouse was mine. They didn't even know I was the one cooking. All they knew was that the Enigma pop-up was the only thing the high society circles of the city were talking about. My sister, always desperate to be at the center of the next big trend, must have dragged them there. They were waiting 3 hours for a table at a place they had mocked as a charity kitchen. "Do we let them in?" Silas asked, his eyes gleaming. "Not yet," I said, adjusting the flame on the stove. "Let them wait. Let them feel what it's like to want something they can't buy." "And Silas?" "Make sure the host tells them we're running low on ingredients. Tell them there's no guarantee they'll even get to eat." As the hours ticked by, I watched them on the screen. I saw my father arguing with the host, a young, tattooed kid I'd hired who didn't give a damn about the Vance name. I saw Alistair pull out his wallet, likely offering a bribe for a table, only to be met with a shrug and a finger pointed toward the back of the line. The man who owned half the skyline was being told to wait his turn by a 20-year-old in a flannel shirt. It was poetry in motion. Inside the warehouse, the atmosphere was electric. The walls were sweating, the music was a low, pulsing bass, and the food coming out of the kitchen was the best we had ever produced. I was cooking with a clarity I had never known. Every plate was a testament to the fact that Alistair could take my building, but he couldn't take my craft. Finally, at nearly 11 o'clock at night, the Vance party was ushered inside. They were led to a corner table, a literal crate topped with a piece of reclaimed wood. There were no white tablecloths here. No silver service. Just the smell of wood smoke and the sound of 100 people enjoying a meal that cost less than the wine Alistair usually spilled on his tie. I stayed in the shadows of the kitchen, watching them through the pass-through. Beatrice looked around with a strange, haunting curiosity. She seemed to recognize the flavors in the air. Serafina was busy taking photos of the rustic decor, irony completely lost on her. But Alistair? Alistair looked miserable. He was out of his element, surrounded by people who didn't fear him, eating in a place he couldn't control. "Orders up," Silas whispered. I personally prepared their plates. I didn't send out the standard menu. I sent out the Vance special, dishes inspired by the meals I had tried to cook for them as a teenager, the ones they had thrown away or ignored, a deconstructed lamb roast, a bitter greens salad with a sharp lemon vinaigrette, and for dessert, a simple, perfect apple tart, the first thing I had ever learned to bake. I watched them take their first bites. Alistair froze. I saw his jaw tighten. He knew. He didn't want to believe it, but the palate doesn't lie. You can lie to a judge, you can lie to a city inspector, but you cannot lie to your own senses. He recognized the technique. He recognized the soul behind the seasoning. Beatrice took a bite of the tart and closed her eyes. A single tear escaped, rolling down her cheek. She knew exactly whose kitchen she was sitting in. Serafina, however, was oblivious. "This is actually incredible," she said, her voice carrying over the din. "Who is the chef here? We should hire him for the skyscraper launch. This is exactly the kind of authentic vibe we need." I decided it was time. I wiped my hands on my apron, adjusted my chef's coat, and walked out of the kitchen. I didn't go to their table immediately. I walked through the room, shaking hands with regulars, thanking people for coming, playing the part of the successful owner. I felt Alistair's eyes following me, burning with a mixture of shock and burgeoning rage. Finally, I stopped at their crate. "Good evening," I said, my voice steady and cool. "I hope the wait wasn't too long. We've been quite busy lately." Alistair's face turned a shade of purple I had never seen before. He stood up so quickly he nearly knocked the crate over. "Julian? What is the meaning of this?" "The meaning of what, father?" I asked, tilting my head. "It's a restaurant. People come, they pay $40, and they eat. I thought you said this business model was a joke. And yet, here you are. 3 hours in the rain just for a taste of it." Serafina gaped at me. You own this? This dump?" "This dump is currently the highest-rated dining experience in the city, Serafina," I replied. "And unlike the skyscraper you're trying to build, this foundation is actually solid." Alistair stepped closer, his voice a low, vibrating hiss. "You think you're clever, don't you? Playing games in a warehouse while your precious Lenigme is being prepped for the wrecking ball. Enjoy your little victory, Julian. Tomorrow morning, the demolition permits are finalized. I'm leveling that block, and there isn't a thing your $40 fans can do about it." I looked him straight in the eye, my hand going to the pocket where I kept the geological survey. "You might want to check the news before you start the engines, Alistair." I sent a copy of the 1994 archives to the Environmental Protection Agency and the City Heritage Board about an hour ago. Along with a live feed of the plumbing leak in my basement, which, as it turns out, is actually the old Katharina spring flowing at full capacity. The color drained from Alistair's face so fast it was as if I'd pulled a plug. You went into the archives?" "Beatrice gave me the key," I said, looking at my mother. She didn't look away this time. She looked at Alistair with a cold, clear-eyed defiance. "You're a fool, Alistair," Beatrice said quietly. "You spent 30 years trying to bury the truth, and you forgot that you raised a son who knows exactly how to dig." Alistair looked between us, the realization dawning on him that he was trapped. If the EPA stepped in, his project was dead. If the fraud was exposed, his company was dead. He had come here to mock me, and instead, he had walked into the belly of the beast. "I'll destroy you," Alistair whispered, but the threat lacked its usual venom. It sounded like a plea. "You already tried," I said, picking up the empty plate from his table. "But it turns out, you can't destroy something that doesn't belong to you. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a restaurant to run." "And you?" "You're blocking the exit for the paying customers." As they walked out, Alistair stumbling, Serafina fuming, and Beatrice walking with her head held high, I knew the final act was about to begin. The skyscraper was falling before a single brick had been laid, and Lenigme was about to rise from the ashes in a way my father could never have imagined. But as I watched them disappear into the night, I realized the biggest battle wasn't over the land, it was over the legacy. And for the first time in 29 years, the name Vance finally felt like it belonged to me. The following weeks were a whirlwind of media frenzies and legal filings. The revelation of the old Katharina spring didn't just halt Alistair's project, it turned the entire Vance development group into a cautionary tale of corporate greed. The Environmental Protection Agency and the City Heritage Board moved with a speed that Alistair never anticipated. By the time the dust settled, the demolition permits were permanently revoked, and the entire block was declared a protected historical site. Alastair's skyscraper was dead before the first beam was ever forged, and his reputation as the city's untouchable king of real estate was shattered. Inside the walls of Lenigme, the atmosphere was the polar opposite. We weren't just a restaurant anymore, we were a symbol of resistance against the cold machinery of wealth. Silas Thorne and I spent those weeks working 18-hour days, not out of desperation, but out of a shared, burning passion. With the threat of the wrecking ball gone, Lenigme truly began to breathe. We expanded the warehouse kitchen, hired more staff from the local neighborhood, and kept the price at exactly $40. I wanted every meal to be a reminder that excellence isn't reserved for the elite, it belongs to anyone who values the craft. The fallout within my family was equally permanent. Serafina, ever the corporate climber, issued a public statement distancing herself from Alastair's oversights, attempting to save her own executive career while the Vance name became synonymous with scandal. Alastair himself withdrew into a bitter, isolated silence. He lost his board seat, his influence, and the fear he once commanded in this city. He had spent his life building monuments to his own ego, only to realize that a foundation built on lies can't support even the smallest weight. Beatrice, however, surprised me. She didn't return to the mansion. She used her own private inheritance to lease a small apartment a few blocks away from the restaurant. She started coming to Lenigme on Tuesday afternoons, not as a socialite, but as a mother. She would sit at a small corner table, order the seasonal special, and watch me work. We didn't talk much about the past, some wounds are too deep for words, but her presence was a quiet acknowledgement that the world she had lived in was a cage, and I was the only one who had been brave enough to pick the lock. As I stand in my kitchen tonight, looking out at a packed dining room of people laughing and sharing stories over plates of food I created, I realize that the $40 price tag was never about the money. It was about worth. My father tried to measure my value in square footage and profit margins, but I found it in the steam rising from a copper pot and the satisfaction of a guest who felt seen and respected. The Vance name no longer feels like a burden or a brand. It feels like a beginning. I learned that you don't have to destroy your past to build your future, you just have to be willing to dig deep enough to find the truth, even if it's buried under decades of stone. If this story reminded you that your value isn't defined by those who mock your dreams, then I've done my job. True success isn't about the height of the tower you build, but the strength of the foundation you stand on. If you enjoyed this journey of justice and passion, please consider subscribing to the channel for more stories of people who refuse to be broken. Leave a comment below and tell me, have you ever had to prove your worth to someone who only saw your price tag? I'd love to hear your story. Thank you for watching, and remember, never let someone who knows the price of everything tell you the value of nothing. Take care of yourselves, and keep building. The end.